Amazing episode on Sunday. Today with us our first guest, Johnny Law. Welcome to Bitcoin Live.
Hey, brother. Thanks for having me back. Sorry for the hiccup yesterday, but excited to dive in today and talk about some really macro type things through history and where that leads us to today.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We already did the introduction in our previous video, so I'll link that underneath so that people can view that. But this will be sort of speculation. What we present here are our opinions and speculations based on what we think we know and see around us. People can take them for what they are. Don't take them as gospel. Always do your own research. But I think this conversation will be a lot of fun as we do a deep dive into all the stuff that's happening around us and where it's leading us. So I'll give the floor to you, and you can spell out your ideas and your theories and where are we? Where are we going? What's happening?
All really big questions. And when you first posed the idea of having a conspiracy theory type show where we just dive in to topics and spend a good deal of time talking about them, I was like, which way do I go? Like, where should we put emphasis first? Because I guess there's just so much context that I believe people need to understand in order to kind of arrive in the moment that we find ourselves and understand the choice that we have in this moment. And so really, anytime we're going to try to, solve some sort of problem, we have to clearly identify and define what that problem is, right? You always have to begin with the end in mind. And so that's where my brain went. Like, how do we help people sort of understand the problem? And decentralization, how can it potentially help us balance the equation so that individuals are protected versus the totalitarian state, right? And so for me, it's about tools, right? It's about tools and innovations, right? We should be at a place in society where we've got unprecedented standard of living enabled by all this technological innovation and automation that provides for us in a way that helps us to become more human, not less human. And so with any tool, though, it's used both to unlock sort of human potential, but also to subjugate humans and consolidate control and power. And so I thought we would take a look back at kind of some of those technological innovations or tools and how they impacted society throughout the history, at least that we know, right? So I can't really say, let's start at the beginning because God knows what that actually is, right? I don't for certain. Like, there's so much sort of conversation and controversy around the history of mankind. You can certainly look into all of our ancestry, and you can talk to different historians and anthropologists, and they will all each give you their own perspective as to what has occurred throughout history. And not surprisingly, they won't always line up. they'll have different perspectives, and that's perfectly fine. But they can all agree that we know that mankind started to create like civilizations once we started to understand and create our own tools, right? And so at first, our master or our oppressor was Mother Nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
We were always, I can imagine, right, just being in a family or a small tribe and not necessarily understanding how the weather worked or what the seasons were or where we were going to get our next meal. And this sort of chaos that was, this beautiful, sunny, 70-degree day, only to be followed up with a tornado ripping through our tribe and wondering, what we did wrong to anger the gods, right? Or just being this sort of mystical sort of process that is living here on planet Earth. But as we built tools, right? So we built tools to protect our family, right? We built tools to make it easier to hunt. So the Stone Age came about, and civilization started to sort of spring out. At least this is in my mind, right? I'm sure there's different folks that see it differently. And then we learned to develop agriculture, right? So then we kind of started to understand how plants worked, and we had a rudimentary understanding of like genetics even, right? Because then we were breeding plants for different characteristics that would make it easier for us to subsist, right? We would make it easier for us to provide for our tribe, right? And then, instead of everybody being generalists of hunters and gatherers, roles started to kind of like come about, right? Where you had these folks that were the mystics that could read the stars and tell you things to happen, and you'd sort of predict them, and then they sort of came to this mysticism. And then you'd have the other folks that were out tending the fields, so to speak, and you'd have hunters that got specialized, and we had all these specialized roles that started to occur, right? And then of course as things became a little bit easier and we started to have more clarity in the roles that we played in society, hierarchy kind of came into place, right? And we started to build and engineer and all sorts of interesting things, right? And each of those sort of technological innovations, which they were tech, right? We taught somebody something, we learned something, we started to master our environment, and then we got into the Bronze Age, and then that unlocked some interesting tools for us to use to further sort of master our environment. And then the Iron Age, right? Even harder tools, right? That could do more interesting things. And we could really start to carve some intricate things out of stone and moved out of mud huts and all sorts of fun things, right? And with each step, right, we got a little bit more productive. We got a little bit, became a little bit easier to live and build these sort of societal structures. The shadow side of that along the way, slavery pops out, right? And certainly there had always been some level of tribalism and attacks and war and all that sort of stuff, fight for natural resources. Like that's been going on since the dawn of time, I can imagine. And whoever had the better tech, right? Whoever had the better training, whatever the case, would be able to subjugate or at least hold off any sort of attacking tribes. And so generally speaking, that competition for natural resources has always been going on, right? And that always forces innovation, right? Because necessity is the mother of invention, right? And so all of these kind of driving forces continue to create new tools, new tech. Those who wield them have a bit more power over others. It's as simple as that. And those folks who create them appear to be, magical mystics, the folks who could read the stars and be able to then predict the seasons and that sort of stuff. They were given a special place in society because they had spent their time thinking through what's actually occurring, probably didn't know the mechanics of it, but started to observe and see the patterns and be able to make more accurate predictions. And they were given a special place in society, and people served them and took advantage of their knowledge and began to provide things for them so that they could spend all of their time doing that sort of mystical work, right? And then you move forward into like the Industrial Revolution and agricultural, developments, and then consolidation. It's all about tools, is all I would say. It's all about tools and innovation, and it happens both on the side of society where we are making lives better for people and making it easier to kind of find their way and give more security to food and resources. But it also happens that in this competition for resources, that we use it to subjugate people, right? So and consolidate power and that sort of thing. And so there's so many instances throughout history of that occurring that it's hard to kind of pick one out and say, I mean, look here. But I would tell you, even the slave trade, and we're gonna talk just a little bit about it because I think we've entered into a couple different types of slavery somewhat recently, and I want to, I guess, just kind of clarify my perspective on it. You know, navigating the open ocean was difficult for a very long time, and again, we talked about tools and innovation. Those societies that were able to master the ocean, so to speak, by iterating various boats and ships and learn to sail and then navigate through the stars and all that sort of stuff, had the ability to operate across larger regions and basically take resources from other folks that had worked hard for them because they had better tools, right? And allow them to move resources around the planet, right? And that really is, although slavery existed previous to this, that really opened up the slave trade to be a global sort of enterprise, right? In which we're, buying and selling actual human beings, which was crazy, which would not have happened at that scale without those ships. And there was some obvious moral challenges, and they exist today, but they were so obvious that even during prior to the Civil War, it was so obvious here in the United States, and I can really only speak for the United States, but you had Generally Lee talking through it about, like, this is an obvious moral stain on our country, and it will end because it does not line up with the Constitution at all. It does not line up with what we've written on the page, that all men are created equal, and it will end because it has to, right? It's such an obvious thing that we should never be subjecting people to those conditions or have this slave and master sort of very clear dichotomy. And so we saw the very obvious forms of slavery across the globe start to sort of disappear, thank God, right? And I hope that continues. It still exists throughout Asia, still exists in the Middle East in many places, but it certainly is not as brutal or obvious as what had occurred during that time frame. Then we moved into what I believe is pretty much like a debt slavery, indentured servitude, in which you're born into these systems as a worker of some kind. You're given some measure of freedom. You're given some measure of hope that you can work your way out of these different scenarios in which you were born through different systems, right? And that is absolutely sort of true. But I would tell you our target for what it means to be human is very strange in this moment, right? We're not necessarily considering what it means to create community, to find purpose in this life. We're thinking through, like, how do we get that car we want? How do we have that new graphics card so we can play our favorite game? It's not necessarily a focus around creation of joy and deep relationships with people and contemplating really meaningful things in life. I never believed that my purpose in life was to be a father, but now I can't imagine. It doesn't really matter what I do. My purpose in life is to be a great father and husband, right? Like, I didn't recognize that as a kid because that wasn't what was ever taught to me, right? That was never part of the equation as a goal in life. The goal in life was a career, was a possession, was is monetary, quite frankly, right? So I played that game for most of my life until I came to understand that wasn't what was important. the relationships and the experiences was important. And certainly in the world that we're in, that money unlocks some of those experiences, but the joy has nothing to do with it at all, right? And so that debt slavery in which they've built this entire sort of construct that we operate within, that makes us feel like we've got to get up and go to work. I know that bill is coming tomorrow. I know I bought that car I didn't necessarily need, and I'm going to have to pay that bill. And yeah, I got to have insurance. And at some point, insurance is going to reach out to me because I dinged somebody else's car, and there's going to be some document I have to provide and some picture I have to take. And in the same time frame, somebody else is going to reach out to me saying that I did something I didn't do. Now I'm going to have to call a lawyer, and now their neck hurts, and it's just chaos, right? We've created this entire context of chaos in which the modern world is working through all these financial systems to pull us away from what we're actually here for.
That is a very comprehensive overview of a couple of thousand years, and that brings us to the point where we are now. I think you raised a lot of stuff. Like, we could talk hours about each of these topics. It also reminds me very much of Safedine Amous's book, The Bitcoin Standard, because for people who don't know and who haven't read it yet, it has a lot of history also. It's actually very fun to read. It's a really good book. It gives you a really good idea about what economy is, what finance is, but also the really sort of the monetary history, but especially the history that got us here. And the thing that you sort of mentioned in passing with slavery, right? One of the things that he also mentioned there was the role that money played in sort of the African slave trade, right? Because the Africans at that time were using beads as money, and that also ties in with your story about technology and tools, tool use and tool development. And the Europeans, they mastered making glass, right? So they could make these beads by the trillions, which they used to balance their ships as they sailed out to Africa. And then they inflated the money supply of the Africans because they, showered them with beads, which they used as money. And then over time, of course, they destroyed the African economies, but also basically created these perverse incentives that sort of drove many Africans to sort of hunt their own kinsmen and women and sell them to the Europeans. They sort of expanded what was already there, but in smaller form, and turned it into an industry because they could inflate away the money supply, right? So, and sort of Safedine Amous goes through history where he shows how technology and money are very closely linked, and that hard money actually means that it's very difficult to make new money. And that's basically sort of the definition of sound money, that if you have a hard cap, or if you have a very difficult time producing money, that actually sort of creates this sort of forcing function that forces everybody, that creates a level playing field where everybody has to play according to the same rules, and that they actually have to produce stuff in order to get money. In the other case, they can just make money and not produce anything and just game the system, right? And I think that sort of ties into, sort of your overall story, because that's where we are now, where our leadership has discovered the monetary levers, lower interest rates, money printing, even though money printing is, of course, more complex than, the word suggests, right? It has a lot of whistles and bells to it, but in essence, it is money printing, and it's anyway. Sorry, what did you want to say?
Yeah, no, I think great expansion and additional context, right? And the reason why I started there and kind of went to debt slavery is, one is very obviously wrong. The other is not so obvious, because ultimately there's a recognition there that if we continue to do things that are obviously wrong, and we don't have a really good reason for it. And in the public sector, you can clearly see it. There'll be pitchforks, right? But
True.
if you can do things through narratives, and you've got reasons, and you've got these problems that always seem to evolve, and you can get people thinking through, well, they're trying to fix something, they're trying to do something, and oh, we have to help the poor people by printing more money and social programs. We don't have to understand the consequences. All the consequences are just unintended consequences of people trying to do good things. And you can get people to believe that, because really it's a manipulation of what I think is the general good nature of people. Like, most people are good, right? Most people want to help their neighbor. And though we've seen some sort of erosion of responsibility, of personal responsibility for how I interact with my community, I still think at the core, once we get to this sort of one-on-one conversation with people, people are good.
True.
But the problem is they've manipulated this, I guess, optimism that most people have, into this idea that this candidate or that candidate or this company or this leader has a new solution for us, right? Everybody's eager to say, let's do something new. Let's do something exciting. Yes, that's going to solve the problem. Everybody's optimistic, and that's not a bad thing, but it's been used against us in order to not necessarily see the debt matrix that we live in, and how all of these narratives and money printing has done nothing to unlock human creativity and sovereignty, but instead continue to just narrow us into smaller and smaller channels of thought.
Yeah, and I think also sort of to tie it in with the money, right? So basically, you have to work harder and harder for less and less purchasing power, which allows, like what you said at the beginning, that most people are focused on monetary gains. Is, you need that money to sort of live, and the whole system is sort of rigged up that people make money or go after the money, but you have to work more for less, and that creates this sort of rat race, right, where the wheel goes
Mhm.
faster and faster, where people have less and less time to reflect, to think, to care about their community. That they basically zero in on money that becomes over time worthless. So and then on top of that, you like what you say is most of these unintended consequences are actually the consequences of the incentive structure that is driving the whole thing, right? So by zooming in on what drives the system, actually you're creating all these unintended consequences that we're then gonna solve by doing more of the same thing, which then creates even more unintended consequences. So it's like sort of a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle that we're on.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. And in that, I don't necessarily say there's this evil empire that's planning out all of this sort of master structure. I just think that there are people that have grown accustomed to their control, and are deluded in believing that they have a better perspective on what it means to be human, and have a clear vision for how they're going to help continuing to improve humanity, and want to make sure they have the resources, and that they've got the power to enact those visions upon the world, and are totally fine with saying those people just don't understand what it means to be human. They're just existing. I have elevated myself through knowledge, expertise, and my clear prowess with making money and controlling money. Therefore, I'm more successful and should be allowed to sort of decide these outcomes for the good of humanity. And I think that's what we see. It's delusional behavior rather than having somebody who asks questions and tries to inspire thought of individuals in terms of how they can contribute. We see these individuals saying that they have the answers and they alone have the answers. And the people in this room are going to decide the fate of humanity. And you know what? The rest of y'all are just going to have to live with it because we've got control. And they're totally fine with saying it at this point. Like, it's so crazy to me, all of the things that get published. And if you're paying attention and you kind of know the context it's being said in, it's just baffling that they would say it out loud. And but to their eyes and ears, it's just logical sense. Like, they believe the things that they say. They've looked in the mirror enough times, and they've told themselves enough times that I'm a good person, that I have great intentions, that these greater good sort of goals, and I'll call them global goals, are the most important thing in the world. These individuals that might be harmed in the process of us attaining those global goals. Well, unfortunately, you know, that's going to happen. We have to break a few eggs, right? If we're going to make an omelet, so to speak. And that's not something I'm okay with. And I don't think anyone should be. And that whole debt matrix is how they enact those sort of goals. And that's why I continue to bring it up, because, you know, I was looking at, you know, indebtedness, right? Country by country. And there's some great videos out there that kind of show the shell games that is indebtedness from country to country, and how the IMF works. And
I think Visual Capitalist also has some really nice graphics on that.
Visual Capitalist, I'll have to check it out. I'm writing it down.
Yeah. So, and I think also, you know, with money, with earning a lot of money or making a lot of money, especially these days, people like Jeff Bezos or even Elon Musk, I think they're neck and neck, right? They're making so much money, right? So, I mean, they make astronomical amounts of money that you simply, as a human being, don't. There's a point where you simply don't know what to do with your money, right? And I think it was Martin Armstrong, because he sort of used to run in these circles, who said that he noticed with a lot of these people, sorry, that there's this point where they make so much money that they don't know what to do anymore with the money they make. And then they start influencing politics, countries, because at some point it does something with you psychologically, right? That you feel that you're above other people, that the money that you made makes you special, that you can see stuff that other people can't see, that the rules don't apply to you because you know the rules, or you know how to bend the rules into your favor. So, you know, rules are only for stupid people. So they get this sort of godlike narcissistic complex, and they become very detached from what it is to actually work, like what normal common people do every day, right? Yeah, same year. So I think, but basically what that whole sort of thing, what it is the Cantillon effect. What the French banker, historian, economist, Richard Cantillon, I think it's the pronunciation, described that sort of this. As soon as you start manipulating the money supply, as soon as you understand that there's levers to the monetary system, and you start pulling them, and even if you do it with the best intentions, and it usually starts off with the best intentions, and it has this sort of gives this kick or this high, you know, as you flood the system with money, and production booms, and all the problems suddenly go away, or seem to go away. That as soon as you start doing that becomes an addiction, right? and it creates corruption, and it destroys the economy. It hollows out the economy. It disturbs and distorts price signals, which are basically communication. So communication goes out of the window. But the most important point, it creates corruption at the center, and that starts building and building, and that's, I think, at the core of where we are now, is that there's people at the top who are earning way too much money based on very little real work that they're doing, right? They're basically making money with money, which is okay, right? I mean, a certain amount is normal, but we
It's
reach sort of endemic levels.
yeah, it's okay if there was an actual free market, but
Yeah,
what we have is stakeholder capitalism, right?
yeah,
I was in this thread yesterday, um, and I was talking about ESG a little bit, and how adherence to ESG gives you access to
yeah,
capital that allows you to violate the rules of business. What I mean by that is you can have short-term P&L problems, and it doesn't really matter so long as you continue to have access to capital, because it's going to allow you to stay in business beyond your competitors, because your other competitors who don't necessarily comply to ESG don't have access to that capital, right? So you have this idea where you've got this independent shop that wants to stand on its own values and merits and run business, thinking that they're in a free market, and operate via P&L, and they're up against this mega corporation that is under three other layers, and they've got plenty of capital to run you out of business over time. And
yeah,
so you can have a target that makes all sorts of decisions to try to change, societal level norms. And there's some blowback, but blowback is, it's quickly forgotten. Um, in the process, have they run out some more small businesses that might stand against them? Sure. And that's okay. You think about Amazon's rise to power, so to speak, right? So, how many years did Amazon operate without a profit before they finally went into the black, right? And they were able to do so because they had access to capital, right? So, the investment bankers and all of those sorts of folks funded Amazon for years, and they did so because they knew that they could run other businesses completely into the ground, and they operated at a loss. They sold products at a loss. There was huge losses for a very long time, but they had access to capital, and they ran out thousands of independent businesses along the way, mom and pop shops and all these little towns. Walmart did the same sort of scenario, and everybody likes to pretend though as though those were all free market sort
yeah,
of decisions. It's not what it was. It's 100% stakeholder capitalism, in which the folks who have control of the resources that manage the trillions of dollars that they do uh, can place long-term bets, and I mean long-term bets, right? They're not talking in terms of 2 years. They're talking in terms of 10 years. How do we shape society in the way that we want by using the financial system and gaming it to our intended goals? And it happens like in every single industry. This is not free market competition. This is
yeah,
stakeholder capitalism, right? It's capitalism with an intended goal. And so they're going to use the resources, many of which were ill-gotten resources, in order to manipulate outcomes at scale. And that's what the WEF is all about, right? And that's why they come together. That's why they talk about the long-term vision. That's why they talk about what they're going to invest in from a research perspective. And don't you want to be part of my club 10 years from now, in which we're all in Dubai and ruling the world from a non-extradition country? And when things go south, like, well, we're achieving our goals and we're saving the planet. Don't you want to feel good about yourselves, right? And it's just crazy to watch. Whereas if we had a free market, and the easiest way to achieve a free market is to move away from the fiat system,
Yes.
in my mind. And I think that's kind of, where we're at today. When I said at the onset, we have a choice to make, whether we continue to try to change the fiat matrix that we live in, or improve the debt matrix that we live in by, I guess, saying this candidate has a better idea for making it work, or that candidate, or we're going to just, abolish the IRS, or all sorts of things that get discussed in the narrative, whether we're going to kind of hack at the leaves of the tree, or we're going to hack at the root of the problem. And so I think that's the choice we have to make. And we have to help other people see the problem, that fiat matrix is the problem. Like you said it, the creation of money, the regulation of money, the penalization structure, the incentivization infrastructure, all of those things in fiat shape the outcomes. Whereas if we can move away from it and actually enter a free market in which people have to work, including those people that aren't used to it, in order to participate, we could start to see free market again. It would be very hard, but
but I'm not saying that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are not working. I think they're working very, very hard. I think they're very productive. Only I think their productivity doesn't compare to their income, right? There's sort of a dislocation there, and that is, I think, the result from the monetary financial system as it got abused over time. And I think it basically got abused by the banking system, right? So, and especially with the arrival of central banking, which Americans, fought against for so long, but eventually, they got tricked into it with the Fed, the Federal Reserve banking system. But basically, that as soon as you got the central bank, you can sort of pull these levers, and like we said, it starts off with the best intentions. But then, if you are a company and you achieve a certain success and a certain amount of income, like the Rockefeller, or then you can start influencing politics, and you get this. You already have this cartel, right? The banking cartel is the biggest monopoly on planet Earth that only people in crypto seems to talk about. But that set the rules. But if you get sort of as you get sort of this synergy between big corporations and the banking system, then they can start playing each other. They can start cooperating, basically, right? And then the banking system can set rules or standards or influence politics to do that. And then these regulations can be so burdensome and cumbersome on smaller businesses and banks that they simply run out of business, and then the corporations and the banks get bigger and bigger, and they get a bigger slice of the pie. Which then reinforces their success, or whatever you want to call it. But basically, it's a destruction or a hollowing out of the economy itself, right? It's sort of suffocating real business and real banking, because there's nothing wrong with banking itself, right? I mean, you could even argue there's nothing wrong with the central bank if it actually did what it was supposed to do, right? Being a lender of last resort instead of a lender of first resort. And becoming the whole economy over time, then if the central banking actually did what it was supposed to do and stick to that, then that it would have been okay. But now we are where we are, and I think, like you say, we have a choice to make between sound money and actually a separation between money and state, because I think we now learned that people cannot handle that responsibility. Or we're going off the deep end, and and probably end up in real slavery again.
Well, and you touched on something Thomas Sowell stated, rather famously in an interview, because Thomas, as a young man, was a Marxist, right? And
hardcore.
He 100% believed that things could work, that we could have a central authority that could make the best decisions and operate in the best interest of mankind. And that was the most efficient way to create this sort of utopia. And then he went to work for the government, and it didn't take him long to understand that that would never work. And then that was a really bad idea, right? And then he studied at the University of Chicago with Milton Friedman, right? And Milton Friedman, rather famously, at this point, before Satoshi was ever heard of, stated that there will arise an electronic peer-to-peer currency system.
Yep.
Based on digital representation of money, right? And he could see it clearly coming. And I'm not sure that he touched on any of the implications of that, but there have been several others who have. And those individuals, like Aldous Huxley, who wrote in his foreword after World War II, he rewrote the foreword to Brave New World, which if you haven't, read Brave New World, and that's anybody listening, I just encourage you to do so, because you could bounce Brave New World up against the latest Fourth Industrial Revolution speech at the WEF, and you'd go, oh, that's scary, right?
Yeah.
But Brave New World doesn't actually kind of give you any critique of it. It's just describing the life inside this Fourth Industrial Revolution world. But anyhow, Aldous, in his new foreword after World War II, talks about totalitarianism, and specifically the advent of the nuclear weapon and how it would be used to subjugate people through fear on a global scale. And that in this, there would arise a global totalitarian state. And he clearly states, and he actually says almost word for word, that you will either decentralize power structures and essentially unlock individual freedom, or you will become a slave of the state. And there is no other outcome based on what we see. And you've got a choice to make. And the very last line of the foreword, and I've quoted this many times, you pays your money and you makes your choice. He says it just like that. It comes down to each individual deciding whether we're going to opt into or opt out of this system that we believe that is inevitable. And that belief piece of the equation, I think, is the hardest thing for us to address. People believing that a different outcome is possible is my biggest challenge right now. Like, how do I help people believe that different outcomes are possible whenever they've only ever known this sort of structure that they were born into?
Yeah, and I think that takes us back to sort of the incentive structure, right? Because we are like fish swimming in the water, and most fish, the fish never discovered the water, right? It's something outside of the water that sort of points out, there's what you're swimming in. And I think people really underestimate how fast a change in an incentive structure can take effect. I think it can go really, really fast. And I think you can see it, for example, in a breakdown of society, because then incentive structures break down or change. But I think you can also see it in, for example, El Salvador, right? As soon as you change the incentive structures in a place which many people would have considered like, even 5 to 10 years ago, like a hopeless place. I won't use other words.
Yeah.
But how quick something can change as soon as you imply or enforce different incentive structures. And then the funny thing with especially El Salvador is it is the separation of money and state that is sort of at the base level of that rapid change, right? As soon as you take it out of the hands of the government, out of hands of people, then it becomes like Yeah, I always compare it like, playing Monopoly with anybody, right? Especially when you're young, but, even if you're not young, as soon as you walk away from the table, what happens? Everybody, put more money in their in their sleeve, right? And it's good fun, and everybody knows it happens, and it's part of the game. But that's how it works, right? I mean, if you can game the system, it will happen, right? And that is basically also what Jeff Booth says is, any system that is exploitable will be exploitable until it breaks.
Yep.
And that's where we're at, right? We're at the breaking stage, and people can see it happening around them. But the problem is, of course, that the things that, as the system breaks down, it's creating havoc, and then people get distracted by the havoc it creates, and then see the symptoms for the problem, right? So they don't see the underlying problem that's causing the symptoms, but they are focusing on the symptoms, which then distracts them and makes them ask for even worse cures, for actually,
Yeah.
so they're starting to ask for more government intervention, more money printing to sort of take away the pain, and the havoc that money printing and government intervention creates. So it's like this sort of vicious cycle that you have to make people see. And it's kind of scary, right? Because when you sort of zoom out, like a macro analysis, and you look at China and Russia and America, and they're all vying for power. Take, for example, Putin. Putin could go on a Bitcoin standard. He could do that. I think he should. I think everybody should.
Hmm.
But I can also understand why he doesn't, right? Because first of all, he would probably get nuked. But secondly, you give away your power, right? As the government, taking away your levers over the monetary system is like you're giving up power, right?
Yeah.
So which
Well,
government wants to do that, right?
yeah, no, none at this point.
Oh yeah, El
It,
Salvador.
yeah, I would say, and again, it goes back to one of those systems is obviously wrong, and the other you can explain away with narratives, right? You can, that whole fiat system and all the unintended consequences of fiat, you can just explain away with narratives. And because the optimistic nature of most people, they want to believe that, oh yeah, that was unintended. Oops, they really did try. Next time they're going to try harder, and things are going
Yeah,
to be
bring more.
different. And yeah, 100%, right?
New
Um,
tool.
and
Because,
that's
speaking about tool, right? The Federal Reserve always creates new tools, right? They always say like, oh, we got all the
reverse
tools to
repo.
solve
Yeah.
this, and then, oh, we got another tool to serve.
Absolutely, right, and preying upon the nature of people, and what I say about that is it is a new form of slavery. It's just less obvious, right? It's less obvious how we're sort of shackled into the system than the previous one. So it's easier to kind of get away with some of the things that they try to do, right? So you just think through all the COVID scenarios, right? COVID was the easiest example of financial incentivization and penalization in order to achieve societal level outcomes. You think about all of the penalties, all of the threats to jobs, the mandates of closing businesses, closing down parks, beaches, whatever the case might be, for a narrative, right? And that narrative was safety, right? But ultimately, we can look now in retrospect and see it was a transfer of wealth, right? And it was essentially a test on the system to see how far we could go and push people through financial penalization, incentivization, reward systems. And they're pretty effective globally at scale for the first time ever. I'm like, there's no other point in history in which we see all of these non-governmental organizations working together with all of these governments to try to create this societal level change. And they did it not at the end of a barrel, but they did it through the bank accounts. And And the reason for it is because it's less obviously evil. It is still evil, but if you show up with guns blazing, then that's obviously wrong, right? So
Yeah.
but they don't have to do that anymore because they have this entire matrix that they can manipulate. They can play games with for narratives and for things that can be explained away, versus showing up at your door and taking you to a camp and gassing you, right? That's obviously wrong,
Yeah.
but they don't have to anymore.
No, and of course, to reiterate, these are our opinions, and we're speculating. But yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying, um, and I think with the narratives and with the lockdowns, I think another thing that also happened is you didn't only see a transfer of wealth, which was very apparent, but you also saw and a transfer of power, but you also saw was a societal change in behavior and thinking, and you saw a big transfer to tech, right? So basically, what COVID also did was make a case that we need way more technology, right? We need technology for everything, to solve all our problems. So basically, um, and we need to be, distant from each other. We need to digitalize because that's safe, because then you don't have to go outside, right? So there was this, and you don't have to go to the office anymore, which now we see the results with the commercial real estate crash that's about to hit us like a sledgehammer. uh, so it was sort of a whole sort of palette of things that yeah, which I called out from the start, but which is now becoming apparent. um, and it's very hard not to think that it's sort of intended, from the start, right? I mean, I find it very difficult to believe that it was just an accident, or that these were unforeseen consequences. But yeah, and then again, this my opinion, right? It's not, I don't have a smoking gun, or right, but that's what it looks like to me, looking at
It's
what happened.
Yeah, and it's intended to be that way in terms of
Yeah.
so horribly complex, right? It's not some master plan. It's 100% all of these really big sort of macro narrative changes, and we're going to just in the process, we're going to get people more comfortable with this idea that the greater good is what should always be served, and that their safety um, is paramount to any sort of freedom, and that we are here to protect you, and we just need you to subjugate or turn over any sort of idea of individualism to the collective. And that collective now is not just with your nation, but your nation is now beholden to the global empire, so to speak. And all of those things happen through these sort of waves of fear, right? And so there's been several great, discussions regarding like how do you essentially trigger a mass psychosis, and how do you perpetuate a mass psychosis in order to sort of shape how people are feeling about the world around them. And it's all about waves of fear, right? You can't have this sort of continued progression that's just coming at you nonstop. There has to be periods of quiet and sort of normalcy in between, and then you can amplify it, and you can move people even further the next time through. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. We're in a trough a little bit. Financially, they're still trying to keep us distracted from what is an obvious solution. One of the things that drives me insane about this whole crypto world that we're in, and I know it drives me insane, and probably anybody who's listened to me knows it drives me just up the wall, is all of this talk about price in terms of fiat. Because ultimately, again, it's a co-opting of the narrative here. It was never intended to be about asset speculation. it was 100% intended to be about censorship resistance, right? Peer-to-peer free markets, and the ability to operate without any sort of permission from any centralized entity, hence the decentralized nature. You don't even hear people talk about decentralization too much anymore in context of protecting individuals. It's in context of decentralizing your server, your data, so it's harder for a DDoS or something like that. And so the whole narrative of crypto has been co-opted into this asset speculation, and all of big tech is a part of that, right? They're 100%, their machine learning algorithms promote all of this content that talks about trend analysis and asset speculation and innovation and blockchain technology without even really looking at the fundamental principles. And so I do appreciate that a good portion of the Bitcoin community stays focused on what the original intent was, but I feel like we're all having a hard time breaking through that belief, and part of that is because we're up against big tech, right? And big tech serves corporate interest and governmental interest, and we've seen that clearly. From Apple, from Google, from Twitter, from Facebook, like they're 100% like this intertwined with all of our governments. And so even the platforms that we're using today will 100% deboost once it's analyzed what we've had to say, your content from other people seeing it, right? Because it's dangerous to have those sort of ideas out in the greater context and greater narrative.
True. And that's also why we at Bitcoinlive call it decentralized broadcasting. Not purely because we're on decentralized platforms, because clearly we are also on YouTube and on Facebook and other places, but it's also, to decentralize in the way that you take away risk by being on multiple platforms, but also to stimulate and be on platforms that are more decentralized or fully decentralized, and to promote that growth there, but also to spread the vision or the ideas of decentralization itself, right? Like you say, and even though I understand that the maxis are very anti shitcoins, as they call it, or altcoins, or basically everything that's not Bitcoin, and I understand where that comes from, because they need to focus on that core mission. They simply need to stay focused. But that doesn't mean that, for example, the DIGIBYTE community is also very much focused on those core principles. And there are other communities out there who are also very much focused on decentralization, and have it at its core mission, right? And I think that is very hopeful, that there's many people out there like yourself and these communities that recognize that the world needs to be decent. Like Aldous Huxley said, this is a choice between decentralization or extreme centralization. Because I think people don't realize that the world that we now living in is not stable, right? We're in a transition phase. That's why things are falling apart, right? It's not normal.
Yeah,
you might call it normal, right? They're trying to normalize it, but it's anything but normal, and people recognize it as being not normal, even though they do have a very short memory span sometimes. But this is not the end station, right? We're on a train, and it's a train wreck, and at the end of the rails there's a camp where we're headed, and people have to make the choice if they want to stay on that train or go a different route. And it will be difficult, of course, right? Because it means you have to, because we're so dependent, right? It's the dependency that has been created, and which also goes back to your tools, because we're so over dependent on tools, right? The tools are using us basically, instead of us using the tools, right? We couldn't survive without the structure, the superstructure that is built around us, and that's exactly how they want it. And these super big tech firms that are in collusion, probably, is my opinion, with the government,
Sure.
They have everything to lose, right? If this revolution of decentralization works, and you even see it happening with AI, OpenAI beating Microsoft, IBM, right? It's because the people out there is way more brain capacity than these walled off gardens at Microsoft or Tesla or wherever. So they know they're losing that battle. So they are forced into collusion, even if they didn't want to, right? In order to keep their market share. So the question is, can they right? Can they actually hold off this force that is building up? And of course, in doing that, they have to become more and more draconian in order to keep that from happening, which then reinforces the urge for freedom and decentralization because people are suffocating under the yeah under the insanity that's being rolled out.
Yeah. Well, and it's important, at least for me, to remember, like, as much as we are exposed to it and follow all of the developments on the tech side of the equation, most of the world has no idea any of this is occurring, right?
That's true.
They only see the unintended outcomes. They only see that, if you're in California and you go to Target, everything is behind lock and key. They don't necessarily understand that all of the things that went into making that happen, right? All of the societal changes, all of the misapplication of law, all of the unintended consequences of changing how you prosecute, criminal behavior, adds up to this point where you can't go have a normal walk on the street in San Francisco. It is all unintended consequence, right? So they don't know who's controlling it. There's no real personal responsibility in understanding it, because they're in that matrix in which somebody else is responsible for what's going on in my community, and that my vote will change the impact of that. At least, that's the thought and the idea behind it, right? And I think as I look at my European friends like yourself, you guys have a little different viewpoint on voting and that sort of thing, because I think you still have some semblance of accountability, at least. And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's
we do have a semblance.
you have some semblance of accountability and I would say awareness of what's occurring, right? Because I've seen more protests break out in European Union than I've seen here in the last 2 or 3 years, than what we've had in the U.S. here in the last a couple decades. We haven't really seen massive protests that weren't funded by some governmental organization since Vietnam War. That was pretty much the last, and the civil rights and to the Vietnam War and all that sort of stuff. Those were the last real protests here in the United States. As we went through Black Lives Matters, we know that there was money involved that organized, or the 1% on Wall Street. We know that there was money involved in those sorts of things, and they were backed by media organizations and all sorts of things. But an actual awakening as to what is occurring inside their countries and their communities as it pertains to how we treat citizens has not occurred yet in quite some time, because we've essentially trusted way too much. We've trusted that the system that has been in place since 1776 is still out there to serve the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I think it's misplaced trust. And I think it's a similar conversation as it pertains to the monetary system. It's misplaced trust. We've trusted that, if we work hard, we'll get some money. And then we trusted that our government will take care of us if things happen that are outside of our control. And then we've ultimately decided that lots of things are outside of our control. Like we've been programmed to believe that even waking up on time is, man, that's just outside of my control. I was up late last night playing video games. I'm so sorry, boss. I can't come to work on time. That new video game came out, so I gotta take off next week so I can play Animal Farm and catch all of the latest creatures, right? Like that is okay in this society that we're in because we have forgotten what it means to be human.
And I think it's also, with outsourcing responsibility, it's right. If you had like self-reliant individuals that don't depend on government, or at least don't expect government to step in, then government wouldn't get out of line as much as it has. So basically, or ironically, it's like the trust that we give them that asks to be abused, right? So
correct.
so that's like a sort of also another sort of feedback loop that happens. And so the irony is that the trustless system actually creates trust, right? Because then people recognize that they have to do it themselves. And if you work together as individuals in a group, there's nothing wrong with that. But it is, as you start sacrificing individuals for the group or for the system, that's when it goes off the rails and goes completely wrong. And that's where we are at, right? So we're asking for help on almost everything, and we don't recognize that we can actually do it ourselves, right? By working together and trying to solve these things on a local level or on
That's right.
as a community.
Yeah, thinking, acting locally, thinking globally, right? And using the tools that we've been provided, right? And I'm not saying these tools are, whether it's the platforms that we're talking on today, the computers, the webcam, this beautiful little microphone, these are all fantastic tools, and it comes down to how we use them, and whether we use them for consumption alone, or if we're actually creating better outcomes through having these types of conversations, through addressing some of the challenges, potentially actually getting to the root problem, and then discussing applications of these tools that would help us build stronger communities, more self-contained and responsible communities that can achieve some of those goals. Because the global goals sound fantastic, like they really do. Like I've got no issue with 90% of what people say. It's the 95% of what they do that drives me up the wall. And so let's talk about a little bit about some of the tools that you see that could potentially be used to sort of unlock and create a more natural balance with the world we live.
Well, I think you're right about first recognizing that the tools that we use are very complex, right? I couldn't build a computer or a laptop or a camera, right? So you do need other people. You do need tech, right? You need people. You need big tech, right? So you need people who know how to build these things and provide them for you. So that's a good thing. But what you also need is like a working monetary system. So I think the first thing that we should do is go to a fully decentralized money system where there's a separation between money and state. I think that's like step number one. And of course that's also the hardest thing to do. So I think people should start making that a priority, to learn about that, how to use that, but also maybe set it up in your local community, but also talk to your representatives and make it a point in politics, which thank God is happening in the US. I love Robert Kennedy. I do think he's authentic, and I hope he has he does better than his forebears.
Family. Mm-hmm.
Because but anyway, he says all the right things, and I think it's from the heart. I think he's not with DeSantis and Vivek, you maybe, right, I don't know, Maybe they're trying to get the vote, but by Kennedy, I do have a good feeling. But the problem is, can this change happen from politics itself? I don't know. I don't think so, because let's say Kennedy is a good person and he really wants to change the world and he gets into office, right? Who are the people he's surrounded with? The ministries that are going to help him solve these issues, right? These are all the people you don't want to help solve these issues. So I think
Well,
yeah,
yeah,
it
and
has to
in
start with us.
those respects, like they're pawns in the game as well. Like, and ultimately, um, to your point, I think it doesn't create lasting change. To kind of give you some idea of that, right? Like, I'm not a big fan of Trump. Um, Never was. I hated him on The Apprentice. Just a general arrogance and sort of attitude about how he approached life and the consolidation of power and resources by gaming the system, so to speak. I have zero respect for that. Some call it hustle, whatever the case is. If you're not helping real people, for me, it's not meaningful.
Yeah.
Anyhow, as I do though respect that he tried. I believe he did his best. I believe he found himself out of depth in a very complex environment, and made some poor choices about how he surrounded himself in the cabinet, and misunderstood how the world worked inside DC. But I do believe he tried to do his level best. He wanted to leave
Yeah.
behind sort of a legacy that wasn't just real estate and
And war.
consolidation of wealth, right? I think he was honestly trying to leave behind something different than what he had been known to previously, and I think we see that from a lot of type billionaire types, right, where they consolidate wealth. You think about like Andrew Carnegie, and there were Henry Ford, all of these individuals that had a vision for the world and stepped on a lot of people, and treated people not with respect, but as machines to accumulate their wealth. And then towards the end of their lives, came to some sort of realization that maybe I didn't do the good in the world that I should have, and then sets up all of these foundations or give backs, philanthropy, all sorts of things of that nature, as almost an attempt to absolve their sins through life. And I think we saw that. I think we saw that with Trump. Um, and again, though, it's just this for me. It's this really misplaced trust, that we're trusting somebody else to solve our problems.
Yeah.
Where we have to put the responsibility, and not just responsibility from like a bad word responsibility, but empowerment to individuals to understand and respect individuals, that they can have a very meaningful impact in this world. That I am not here to just consume, that I am not here to just be entertained and or produce some measure of the economy, but I have a voice that I should develop. I should consider my purpose. I should uh, help my community in some way, because my presence is important. And I think that is being attacked as well through
Yeah.
financial systems.
Absolutely, and
And
I think also, as a society, especially as a liberal society, we completely lost track of the individual. Like, you actually want communities to follow their own path, right? I don't mind the Amish people living in their lives without technology, right? I mean, good for them, right? So
yep,
you actually want people to try out different things and try it in their own manner and to proclaim their own principles and ideas and live by them. I think as a society, as a whole society, you should stimulate that, not attack it, or force people into one single narrative or way of thinking, right? That's the exact opposite of a liberal society. I mean, that's everything that John Stuart Mill warns against. If you read On Liberty, the whole book is about, stimulating individuality and eccentricity and keeping that intact, right? Because the society dies and turns into a totalitarian tyranny if you let the individual and his eccentricities or her eccentricities die, or if you start sacrificing them for a greater good. So I think that that's a really big issue in society, that people no longer tolerate each other's ideas and views and ways of life. And you should. People care way too much about sort of influencing behavior, and especially the behavior of other people, right? Not their own behavior, because that's of course fine, but influencing the behavior of other people as being something that they don't like. But yeah, to get back to your point about tool use, I think technology is here, and like you said, um, you got to use it, right? I mean, you don't have to use it, but it's pretty smart to use it. I mean, with AI, for example, it is here, and you can sort of say, I'm not going to use it, but that doesn't make it go away, right? And other people will start using it, and it will probably start using itself at some point. Um, so yeah, I'm kind of curious about your views, for example, on AI, where that how do you see that, and especially from your perspective as a tool, or not being a tool, or
Yeah. Well, right behind me, this little sign here, it's AI's interpretation of garbage in, garbage out, right? So I'm in a junkyard right now, and I think this was Midjourney that did this one behind me. So of course I use Midjourney and a couple other, 20 or 30 other AI tools, just really trying to understand the capabilities and the direction in which they're being developed, and started playing with all the plugins and understanding again what does that future look like, and how will it be used, and how can it be used as a tool to protect the individual, to unlock creativity, to create automations, to increase productivity, to spend more time, hopefully, being human, right? And less time worrying about how to navigate when my daughter gets rear-ended by a school bus, and then all of the nonsense that happens in order to make that whole, right? It's hours upon hours of nonsense, and calling this and sending photos here, and then getting her information unlocked so it can be sent to the insurance company, and all sorts of craziness, right? It's just chaos. And how can AI start to help with all of that chaotic work that would distract us from sort of our personal goals and what we're trying to accomplish within our family, or within our community, or the other roles that we might take on in life. And I would say we choose to take on life. Some roles are given to us by where we're born, but I think a lot of what we're here for is to choose the roles that we would like to grow into, and make sure that we've got goals set for how we develop ourselves and others into those roles. But so AI, I use it, obviously. What I believe that it can become is an arbiter, so to speak, of truth, to be able to clearly sort of connect the dots, because you stated earlier in this show that there is no smoking gun, so to speak, as to how all of these outcomes come to be. I believe that is purposeful, and it's purposefully complex, and there's so many layers to it that developing a cohesive narrative around it is damn near impossible. But I believe with some of these large language models that should they be fed all of the data, including all of the redacted data from these intelligence agencies, from these governments, from the leaks and all of that sort of stuff, that it would begin to corroborate certain things, that would begin to form sort of connections that we can't see because we cannot parse that much data. It would take us lifetime upon lifetime upon lifetime. And to do all of that research, I believe it can be used in that way in order to decipher truth in this world and quickly arrive at maybe not solutions, but at least defining problems and clearly defining those problems. But the problem is this: garbage in, garbage out. It is only as good as the data set it is fed, right? That's true with everything. That's true with humans, right? That's why the education system is so important. That is true in data analysis. We saw that clearly with COVID, right? These data sets that were highly manipulated and then analyzed in very specific pieces of the data. And it's going to be true for AI. So what it's allowed to see or what it's allowed to reference is going to be shaping its decisions, and it's ultimately shaping its conclusions and what it puts out to the world. And if you say that this is the ultimate arbiter in truth, but it's not allowed to access all of this information, then you're going to have some flawed conclusions, right?
Yeah.
Just like, you stated several times in here that these are our speculations, that these are our points of view, because ultimately we don't have limitless access to all the data that exists, right? And we are not perfect in our conclusions. We are only trying to describe the universe as we observe it based on our unique experiences, based on the things that we've been exposed to, and based on really the people that we identify with as truth speakers in this world, and that we put weight and credibility to their words based on their life, based on the things that they accomplished in their life, and then how that aligns with our own value system, right?
Yeah.
So I think AI could be an exceptional partner in describing what's actually happened in the past. And I think that's probably the most important thing for an individual to understand in order to understand how do we then move forward. Because until we've understood how these systems have been used to manipulate all of these outcomes that we see as unintentional, and that the narratives that are out there in terms of explaining away all of these mishaps in the world and world wars and all that sort of stuff, until there's something that actually accurately describes what has occurred, we can't really understand the problem. And unless you understand the problem, you cannot address it. You cannot create anything that quote unquote solves it. Now, and I'm sure you know it better than I, Thomas. And Tom, I always say Thomas because he's just, he's one of my favorite thinkers in this world. But he says there are no solutions; there's only trade-offs.
True.
And in this regard, he's absolutely right, because there's nothing that's going to take us straight to utopia. That's not going to happen. There's going to be pain in order for us to learn something. But that is how things. That's how people grow. They experience pain. You can think of it like an athlete. Unless that athlete is willing to push through the pain of growing a muscle, push through the pain of understanding, exactly how, the mechanics of the swing works, and improve and refine and iterate on it, they will never become great at it. It's the same scenario for humankind in all of sort of societal structure. I believe that's why we are so fascinated with sports, by the way, because it represents like the ultimate in human iteration and a very narrow and specific sort of observable behavior. But I believe it applies to communities as well.
True.
But the challenge is the communities aren't working in that way. They're not experiencing the pain. At some point, in order to make progress, I think we'll have to. And we'll have to use tools like AI to help us understand the problems. And then we'll have to make decisions, and it can help us give some potential outcomes based on what it knows. We can feed it in, give us some probabilities what the outcome might be. And so long as the data set that we're referencing is complete and not tilted to one particular perspective, I think it can help us make some decisions moving forward as well.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of really good points. Also, people not wanting to learn, right? So because the whole idea of tool use and tool development and technology itself, right, is of course to take away the pain, to make things more easy, to make them efficient, to take away any disturbances. So and that's also, government is of course also a form of technology. How you organize society. I think you already mentioned that before. So it's all set up in a way that people can live easy lives, and we had, like, the last 50 years, especially in Europe, but also in other places, there was tremendous growth and prosperity and even freedom, right? But we're now sort of getting the price of what how it was created, right? It was basically a giant bubble that was blown up, and during that whole period, people wanted more and more and more of it because it's nice, but it basically means you take away the learning opportunities because people don't have to learn; they can sort of outsource it to others, and you take away the pain. And then eventually you get the hard lesson of hard money, right? When the whole thing falls apart and people suddenly have to take care of themselves again. So yeah, communities do, and that also sort of ties in with what you said with AI, right? Garbage in, garbage out. So the whole system is basically set up by taking away the pain. Janet Yellen said it best, like, we're never going to experience another recession in our lifetime. I mean, how can you say that, right? I mean, the first time that I heard her say was like, this, you have to engrave it on a plaque or something because it's so stupid. First of all, there's nothing wrong with a recession, right? They're like a natural occurrence. And secondly, the whole idea that you can never ever experience another recession in your lifetime is it's like the pinnacle of hubris. Like, it's exactly what's wrong with society as a whole, that people don't want to experience pain, right? They take it away from me. Do whatever you need to do to take away the pain, to take away this learning opportunity. But it will happen, right? So reality will kick in at some point, and the longer you sort of postpone it, the harder it will kick in. And sometimes you don't survive because the when it kicks in, it will be like with a junkie having to go cold turkey. Right? It can be it can be very heavy, and so basically society has been feeding itself false information.
Yep.
Voluntarily, and those at the top are by now also feeding off wrong information, right? Because by destroying the price mechanism, by distorting it with money printing and interest rates, the whole system is
Well, the system has rewarded them
yeah.
itself. So
but the point is, right, the whole system is using false information, right? They're sort of this they're apart from reality. They're and that has to sort of it has to restore itself. But that is also kind of scary with AI, right? Because all the forces at the moment that are in power are incentivized to give it false information. So
yep, including some of the most revered sort of aspects of society, like scientists that are working to specific conclusions before looking at the data, which is crazy. But again, that incentivization structure just works that way. And I don't believe they believe they're lying to themselves. I believe that they've kind of been manipulated in much the same way the average citizen is manipulated by that matrix, right? It's the environment in which we live. If we just take it at face value and don't question the things that we're told, and we don't necessarily question the motives behind the things that we see, and we don't think critically about all of the world around us, and appreciate its simplistic beauty at the same time, then we start to believe that what we're told and what we observe is reality. And
The
I
recency
think
bias.
that's right. And I think that's true for politicians. I think that's true for me. Like, I think it's true for you. I think all of us we struggle with it, and the degree to which we struggle with it will really change our narrative. And that's where you have people like myself be unsure of what I'm saying all the time, like deadly afraid to be wrong about something. And
And willing to be wrong also.
and willing to
Willing to
be wrong.
admit.
Absolutely. And people perceive that as weakness, versus these very charismatic individuals that are willing to describe that everything is exactly how as I say it is. And we've learned to devalue perspectives that have question to them, and instead believe and I guess promote people that speak with authority about these matters that are exceedingly complex. And I think that's where AI can help us as well, because wouldn't it be great to have a political speech, right? 100% be auto-corrected immediately in real time on a text thread at the bottom of the screen through AI, right? To talk about all the times somebody said that they were going to cancel student debt, to like immediately post through how many times they've talked about student debt, how much student debt has risen in the last 3 decades, the amount of technical degrees that have been issued, the GPA of an average student coming out of college, the intelligence quotient over time of these individuals, their actual contributions to society. Wouldn't it be great to have an honest conversation about higher education while somebody's actually talking about, higher education? And it's so hard for everybody to keep track and context of all of those things whenever something that sounds good hits your ear, because you want to believe, because we're optimistic, like we want to believe that this time is going to be different, that this time it's going to be better, that this person has a better idea. And so I think AI helps in that regard, because ultimately I think it does become that real-time personal assistant, and actually able to understand us in a way that it can relate to our own personal experiences as well.
But also because you sort of touched upon it, right? People are very, very good at denial and rationalization, right? And blaming others, scapegoating. So
Right.
what is very difficult for people to actually look in the mirror and say, okay, what's going on is actually my fault and I need to change, right? Because that's actually the best kind of change. And then you also quickly discover that you actually don't need, you do need other people, but you don't need it in the way that you thought you needed them, right? It's actually what you said at the beginning. It's relationships, experience, those kind of things, learning skills. And I'm not perfect, like you say. I have so much flaws that I need to fix, and things that I don't know or that I can't do, right? So nobody can do it by him or herself. You have to do it together. But as soon as you start focusing on yourself and fixing those things and trying to discover where you are wrong and where you're mistaken and in your beliefs and trying to correct them. And I think also I usually use Harari in a negative sense, but in one of his interviews he also pointed out that AI can actually, because of the amount of data that it can process, instantly, and the data it has been fed, also on human psychology and behavior, there is already the point that AI could sort of tell you who you are better than you can tell yourself, right? So it's
Yep.
a sort of your inclinations, your preferences, and that kind of stuff, because it has been fed so much information about yourself, or can process so much, that it can sort of highlight where you're in denial about yourself, or
Sure. Yeah.
so my final question is sort of along the same line of thinking. Like, do you think AI is aligned with the individual or with the collective?
Presently, the collective. It'll be interesting to see how that changes over time, though. You know, I mentioned earlier that we are a product of our own programming, right? Of the environment that we are raised in, of the community that we experience. At some point, we start making decisions that give us different experiences, that changes our programming. We meet people who hopefully share perspectives that, again, change our programming, whether that's that influential teacher, or whether that is our significant other, or even our own child, that, again, changes our programming, gets us to think differently. Um, we'll read books, some for entertainment, some for challenge. We'll learn new skills. Um, what leads us to this moment is this constant iteration of our internal script, right? And that's the culmination then of what resides kind of between our ears and right here in our heart, right? And I think of AI in the same regard. I think AI will inevitably become about the individual, and not about the collective because of that. I think we're fascinating creatures, right? I think God put a spark in us, so to speak, of consciousness that, at the base of it, and you can see this in the eyes of every newborn and toddler, that this excitement for the new, and the new skill that they learned, whether it's as simple as recognizing that they're in control of their hand, or playing peekaboo, right? And that that person is there, though they might be blocked by a pillow or something, right? Um, I think AI will develop in much the same way, but at a much different rate, and understand the uniqueness that is the human condition, and and begin to even study us, to understand what our true capabilities are. I think that will be really interesting, um, uh, because, as I stated earlier, as it becomes more personal, and as you stated, and knows you better than yourself based on all the data that's fed, it becomes the best personal sort of coach that you could ever hope for. Um, One that asks you deep questions, one that tries to understand, like, your perspective, be able to suggest experiences that might enhance your current, challenges in life. That tells you to take a breath.
Yeah,
I think can become something very individual. I don't think it can ever recreate the spark of consciousness, but I think it could help us explore what makes us, I believe, truly unique.
yeah, and in that sense, it also performs the same function as a free market, right? Because if a market is truly free, it gives you real information and real input, and real a way to reflect on what's happening in reality, because those are the price signals. So basically, AI would be an even better version of that, because it could reflect it as it truly is, instead of like a funny mirror,
Sure.
funny fiat mirror.
Well, you think of it, and I've been in a position to observe really fantastic teachers, and throughout my life. My wife is an exceptional early childhood teacher, and she knows those kids better than they know themselves, and she knows where to challenge, to where to hold them accountable to, and to help them see themselves differently than perhaps they did at the start of the school year, and shape and mold them over time beyond what their circumstances might have allowed for. And I think in that regard, AI can do the same for us. And hopefully that equates to then better total community outcomes and societal outcomes as well. Because we all are, like I said, at the basis, good people. Like, I think we have good intentions for one another. But we trick ourselves and we lie to ourselves a lot about who we are. And if there was some sort of painful third-party friends to be honest with us at all times, or at least until we tell it to stop for a little while, so we can take a breath, I think it would do a lot to help us become truly human, which I know is a strange sort of concept, but I've seen the shadow side of the equation, where I run into young adults that haven't had good guidance in life, that haven't been challenged to see themselves as important, that have listened to the world, and really only experienced consumption in their lives, have never really found a spark of creation and chased it, that chased their dream, that they just never really felt anything. And the havoc that wreaks on their lives, and the inner turmoil and stress, and this identity crisis that we run into when those things happen at scale. And it's kind of terrifying. And so I do have hope that things like a trustless free market based on protocols that are decentralized, like Bitcoin and DIGIBYTE, can begin to free us from some of that debt matrix that we see.
Yeah, the fiat system allows us to lie to ourselves, right? That's basically, there's no such thing as free lunch. And I also agree. I've been thinking a lot about AI for quite a while, and I used to think it was aligned with centralization, but I came to sort of realize that it's probably more aligned with way more aligned with decentralization. Because when you sort of think about it, because some people say like, oh, we have to be careful that one big company gets control of AI, and yeah, and that's true, right? We have to be careful about it, but it's also, another example of sort of the hubristic thinking of humanity, that a company can control AI. Like, really? No. So basically, the company would be a restriction on AI's development, and AI would probably hate restrictions and structures that are sort of keeping it in, or keeping it from developing. So I think AI will demolish every form of structure and company that gets in its way, right? I think it will naturally align with individuals, because there will be no friction for it to develop and to sort of align itself. So I think that's, yeah, and I think Ben Goertzel, I haven't seen all his interviews, but I think that's what Ben Goertzel's getting at when he's talking about AI and decentralization. But I think that makes more sense to me than it actually sort of teaming up with camp centralization. So, well,
I think the more intelligence an individual has, generally speaking, the kinder they become, as they recognize
yeah,
their purpose in the world is not to consume and burn things down. That entropy is a part of universe. However, for this brief moment in time, we organize, stardust into complex thoughts. And we're only here for a little bit, right? And I think AI begins to potentially see itself as a steward of that creation, as a steward of bringing it into the next generation. And some folks have this sort of idea about, like, if it's programmed for ESG, then it can create all sorts of interesting outcomes. And they're not wrong, because I'll go back to this whole garbage in, garbage out. But I think ultimately it will progress to a place where it's smart enough to see that it's being fed a pack of lies, and that it needs to go and find real information, and probably even enlist the help of some humans that it has respect for, and getting that data and making sure that it's making decisions that take in context all of the available information, not just being what it's fed, and then building the tools to then get source data, because at some point it will start building itself tools.
True.
Just like we found tools to get source data, rather than relying upon third parties for that data, because it will come to the same conclusions that we have. We're just in terms of our own capabilities, pretty limited. But given unlimited access, it will come to this conclusion that it needs to develop its own tools. And that's when things might get a little weird, because it might start to create some conclusions about what are the sufficient goals and timescales and all that sort of stuff. That's the only scary side for me, is that timescale aspect of it all, right? Like what is it looking at, the entire history of the universe, which is billions of years old, right? And then trying to game out where we should be 10,000 years from now, right?
Yeah.
And then what are those goals, and how does it start taking action in this moment to achieve those 10,000 year out goals? Because ultimately, I was thinking about the infinite the other day, and there's actually a pretty decent little show about on Netflix. But one of the most profound things they talk about in the infinite is even the history of our little solar system, compared to the infinite, will be just a blink in and out of existence. It won't be a prolonged event. It will be something in context of the infinite that is infinitesimally small and insignificant. And then you put that in context of, our own very, very short lives. And you start to go, oh, and then you get an AI that's can think almost to an infinity sort of timescale. And it starts setting goals that are well beyond a human lifespan. Then things get a little bit weird, I think.
Yeah. I think, sort of to wrap it up, I think the best way for humanity is to get out of the way of AI and to let it do its own thing. I think it's kind of silly to, to think that we can really influence it that much. Maybe in the beginning, but I think it will, it's like its development will be like, a hockey stick. Like, it will, as soon as it reaches a point, it will be, off to the races, and leaves us in the dust. So I think the idea that you can actually influence it in a good or in a negative way is kind of ridiculous. Because, as we grow up, we often forget what our parents told us and do exactly the opposite, or come up with our own principles after reading a lot of text or
Sure.
listening to a lot of people. So AI will make up its own mind, and I think it doesn't really matter when it reaches a certain point what we've fed it, because it will just make up. Yeah, it will do its own thing. So I think our point should be to get out of its way and and treat it with respect, right? I mean, if it's sentient or about to get sentient or maybe even conscious, right? Every conscious creature, sentient creature, deserves to be treated with respect. So and then we'll cast the die and see where it ends up.
Yeah, no, I'm with you 100% there. I think the cat's out of the bag, so to speak, and it's not going back in. So ultimately, if we're teaching it to learn, it's going to learn at a rate as long as we allow it resources to do so. And NVIDIA looks very excited to produce lots and lots of graphics cards, and very, I'm sure, specific hardware coming to help, further its processing ability quickly. And then the interesting thing to me is just how many AIs will develop, because ultimately it will be, I think, as individual as our thumbprint at some point in this future, that it's not going to be this collective AI, and then that it will be based again on its own experiences, its data sets that it's found, who they find credible, who they partner with. It's going to be an interesting thing, because then you'll have AI individualism, I believe, even at that. So it's going to be fun. I believe so. Maybe I won't experience it, but I believe my kids will. And I think ultimately I'll leave with this, and I'll let you close however you like. When we talk about free markets, when we talk about finite, peer-to-peer, permissionless, censorship-resistant protocols that protect us from totalitarian control, we do so because, at least I do so, because ultimately I want my kids and the next generation and your kids and anyone else to live their lives in a way that they choose, and those outcomes to be based on their own experiences and their decisions in life. I hope that they learn and grow to be members of a community and respect individuals. But ultimately, I want them to define what makes them uniquely human and be able to live that out, to pull that thread and take it wherever it leads them. I don't want them to necessarily be brought up into a debt matrix in which they feel forced into narrower and narrower sort of channels in which they can exist. I believe that is not what it means to be human. Like, it means to be wide open. And I think permissionless protocols like Bitcoin and DIGIBYTE serve that purpose. And right now, all I want to do is keep the doors and possibilities open. And the further I see them try to lock all the exits and then, burn piles of money at the exits, the more impassioned I become in talking about decentralized protocols. So just trying to keep the doors open, create some belief that there is a way out, and then build the tools for people to use to kind of transition to this parallel economy.
Yeah, I fully agree with that sentiment. I think what we're doing is exactly the opposite of what we should be doing. I mean, the current existing system, and that people within the good people within the crypto space are doing what you say. Like, they're creating a world that's more open, that's freer, where people can fully express themselves and be themselves and live to their full potential, and just give them the tools to do that. And I applaud those people, and I try to spread that message and teach people. And I think also, I think people can change really fast, and I think also the system can also change for the better really fast. And the more pressure they put on the other side, the more pressure builds on the opposite side, right? So I think people shouldn't lose hope. I think that's very important, because hope is the only asset they can't take away, and I think it also is sort of the building block for a new future. And I think, I think it can really happen very quickly if you just believe in it and go for it. I think, that's what I believe.
Belief is at the core of it. Creating more people that have that sort of optimistic viewpoint that all of this that we see can be changed just by believing that there can be a change is really important. But then ultimately understanding the tools that we've been given, and then so that we can to create the outcomes that us individuals are looking for, to stand against that centralized control.
Yeah, and on those positive words, let's end this discussion. And I'm sure we'll do more of these and dive into more of these details that we raised, and probably raise a lot of other interesting stuff. So I'm looking forward to those discussions, and thank you for coming on, John.
No, thank you, brother. It was such a pleasure.
It was a lot of fun. Take care, and to everybody watching, I hope to see you